He was watching the crowds, waving at them steadily with a stiff forearm, his right hand moving only a few inches out from his face and back. It was a small movement and curiously formal, but I thought quite effective. I heard a low, monotone rumble from the back, and then I realized he was responding, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over to people who couldn't hear him but who could sense he was answering them, who knew that contact had been made. And then he turned his head slightly and said, "Jackie, take off your glasses." And the crowd was wild. We passed a school, and the children surged into the street. In the downtown city, people were back in the streets and packed the sidewalks clear back to the buildings. They were hanging out of windows 10 stories up, waving banners and signs. They were smiling, laughing, pointing, waving, shrieking greetings. Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm Jess Connell, and if you're new, then welcome. I would love to earn your subscription today. We're in part 2 of our read-through of this November 1967 recounting by Governor Connally.
Martin, just before it occurred, of course, we'd had a great morning in Fort Worth, a magnificent breakfast. He spoke in a slight drizzle. We made the trip to Dallas, with huge throngs along the way. We got into downtown Dallas. There were tremendous crowds, real warmth, real understanding, real appreciation. And Nellie and I saw it so vividly because we were riding in the car with them. We did not attempt to acknowledge the obvious ovation that they were getting because we knew it was for the Kennedys. The reception had been magnificent. The president had remarked on it. So had Miss Kennedy. As a matter of fact, I guess not 30 seconds before the tragic incident occurred, that Nellie had turned to the president and said, "Mr. President, they can't make you believe now that there are not some in Dallas who love you and appreciate you, can they?" And he said, "No, they sure can't."
He and his wife Nellie were in the car with Jack and Jackie on the day of the assassination. We've already gone through the first part of this, and actually that part gave us the political background to understand why he was coming, and also we got to look at previously unpublished photos. This was 4 years after the assassination, like this photo that shows the Grassy Knoll just a split second before the first shot. So we went through that in part 1. This is part 2, and we are going to hear more about Governor Connally's perspective on the assassination and on the events that led to it. I do have an advertisement for a Mercury Cougar, if you're interested in that. Old muscle cars. All right, it says, Kennedy wanted to raise funds and meet the opposition. This was the situation in June 1963 when I went to the president's suite in El Paso. You may remember in the last reading, he was talking about the relationship between Governor Connally and President Kennedy, and then also how he came into the hotel room and LBJ and JFK were kind of teasing each other. They had this back and forth in June about, are we or aren't we going to go ahead and host the president here in Texas? This was the situation in June 1963 when I went to the president's suite in El Paso, and for the first time, he asked me directly to help. I agreed. Most of my reasons for delaying the proposed trip were past. I had successfully gone through 3 elections and healed some of the wounds. I had stepped into the governorship and I had seen my program through the legislature. The president nodded and said he had been thinking about 4 fundraisers or meetings in Houston, San Antonio, Fort Worth, and Dallas. I was still gulping at the idea of 4 dinners when he went on blithely to say he thought Mr. Johnson's birthday, August 27th, might provide a logical date and reason for the trip. I'm sure Mr. Johnson appreciated as well as I did the futility of the early date, but I think he was prepared to let me carry the ball for a while. Well, Mr. President, you know my feelings for Vice President Johnson, but I must tell you that the very people you will want to reach are likely not to be here. Texas gets mighty hot in August. It's funny you said that. That was my first thought too, especially in pre-air conditioner days. August is not when you want to be doing anything in Texas. If you don't like that date, what date do you like? The president asked. I wasn't prepared to offer an immediate alternative, and the president said, still friendly, but definitely in a business-like fashion, well, let's get on with it. We've been talking about this for a year and a half or more. Let's get an agreement about what we were going to do and get together and start making our plans. For some time thereafter, I gave a great deal of thought to the president's visit. I should say that once we began, I never looked back. I was fully ready to go ahead. But I was anxious to see that it went off well, and the first move to that end was to drop the plan for 4 dinners. I felt that there should be one dinner, and that it should not be held in any of the 4 cities, the president suggested, but in Austin, the state capital, which is a smaller city, centrally located, and traditionally considered neutral ground in Texas. It was the only place to which people from other Texas cities would come with no feelings of rivalry. That's interesting. Fort Worth people would resist supporting a Dallas dinner or Dallas a Houston dinner, but they would all come to Austin. On October 4th, 1963, I was to be in Washington, and now with firm ideas on what the visit should be like, I asked for an appointment with President Kennedy. He came from behind his desk in the Oval Office with outstretched hand, then sat down in his rocker, gestured me to one of his 2 small couches, and moved immediately into the subject. How about those fundraising affairs in Texas, John? He asked. Mr. President, I think we can have 4 separate affairs, but I think it would be a very serious mistake. He didn't answer immediately, and I went right on. In the first place, I don't think 4 will raise appreciably more money than 1 properly organized affair. Certainly not enough to make up for the political cost to you. You haven't made a real visit to Texas except to El Paso since you became president. You've made no speeches and no appearances. If you come down there and try to have fundraising affairs in 4 cities on one trip, they are going to think you are trying to financially rape the state. I used just those words. I'm inclined to agree with you, the president said. Mr. President, what really do you want to do on the trip? In addition to the fundraising, he said, he wanted to see and talk to some of the Texas people who opposed him so sharply. I think it galled him that conservative business people would suspect that he, a wealthy product himself of our capitalistic system, would do anything to damage that system. He added with some heat, they don't have any real reason to fear my administration. I had a strong conviction that if the business community of Texas could see President Kennedy in the flesh and talk to him, it would find quickly enough that he was no extremist. I told him now, if you come down there to try to convert some of the more conservative people who have been against you, or at least lukewarm, you are going to have to be with them and talk with them, and it is going to have to be done in a basically non-political setting because a lot of these people just won't come to a straight political meeting. What's more, these are the people who are going to supply the funds you need. Texans are a courteous and hospitable people. That portion of the business element which distrusted President Kennedy would have felt neither desire nor obligation to attend an event hung around support of the National Party. But I knew those same men would count it a point of pride and honor to entertain and welcome the president if he appeared as president instead of politician. And I went on, now, I hope you can give us 2 days. Time for an affair in Houston, something in San Antonio, a breakfast in Fort Worth, a luncheon in Dallas, and the dinner in Austin. This dinner will be at $100 a plate and will be strictly political, but the rest of it should be nonpartisan. It will leave a good taste in everyone's mouth. It will enhance your prestige with all of Texas, and it will help you with the business community you are interested in reaching. I'll accept your judgment on that, John, he said. I told him I believed he would carry Texas in 1964, though it might be close. I would anticipate that, he said. Lyndon thinks we'll carry Texas, but he says it'll be hard. The thought irked him. Texas is Democratic country. We shouldn't have a hard race in Texas. I suggested that if the trip was successful, his problems might be considerably eased. And then I ventured that I thought it would help a great deal if Mrs. Kennedy accompanied him. She had not previously gone on essentially political trips. She had captured the imagination of the country and particularly of the women. She had come to stand for culture, beauty, and fashion. Her hairstyle and her wardrobe were news. The wives of the men he wanted to attract would be most interested in seeing Mrs. Kennedy, and her presence would make the trip seem less politically oriented. The president nodded. Mrs. Kennedy was in Europe then, he said, but on her return he would ask her. I recall he said, I agree with you. I would hope she would come. I believe she was in Europe, maybe even, if my memory serves me, on Areonassis's yacht. I believe he invited her to come and recover after she lost baby Patrick, and that Jack thought it would be a good thing for her to go. And so she went, and she spent time just resting and recovering in the Mediterranean, which sounds really nice until you realize that she was recovering from having a baby who died just a couple days into his life. That baby's death really wrecked the two of them, and it did emotionally bring them to a place of understanding one another better, to a new closeness that they enjoyed the last few months of his life. So that's where she was. I was having dinner that night at the home of Vice President Johnson, and when I arrived, he had already learned that I had been with the president. He was distinctly irritated. He greeted me. Well, did you get the trip all worked out? I said yes, and he said, I guess you think I have no interest in the state of Texas or in this visit. I pointed out that I could hardly instruct the president as to his White House visitors, but Mr. Johnson was not mollified. So he was irritated that he wasn't invited to the meeting. Well, I hope you know that I've got a slight interest in Texas and in this trip too. I regretted my thoughtlessness in not discussing the plans with him, and I apologized. I went back to Texas, called in my associates, and began the extraordinary planning that a successful presidential trip requires. There is no end to the detail that must be mastered, always with the knowledge that a single point overlooked can snarl a trip so hopelessly as to ruin it. It is easy to fall behind schedule, but a rule of working politics is that if a candidate falls an hour behind schedule, he might as well not have come. The people who have waited to see him will become irritated and resentful, and his message falls flat. Then it is all for nothing. Soon the Secret Service men were in Texas, and behind them came the president's own advance men, sent down from Washington by the White House to oversee all the arrangements. Just as I had anticipated, trouble began almost immediately. It lay in the great schism in Democratic politics in Texas, in a personal feud that grew in turn from a political feud that's even older. It had nothing whatsoever to do with the president's trip to Texas, except that in a tiresome fashion it complicated some of the arrangements. But later, after the tragic end of the trip, it was to assume huge and distorted proportions. For a number of years, Ralph Yarborough, now senior senator from Texas, you'll remember in our recent reading, he is the one who was just wiping his face away, just crying at Parkland Hospital. He is in the motorcade. Ralph Yarborough had been in a violent controversy with Mr. Johnson and with the majority of the state's Democratic leadership. The senator's support came generally from arch liberals and labor, and he had run 3 exhausting, expensive campaigns for governor in the 1950s before he managed to win his seat in the Senate. It is hard to describe the bitterness that such campaigns generate in a state in which each individual must rally and hold his own support instead of relying on a party structure. I would not attempt to chronicle here the claims of betrayal and the counterclaims of perfidy that infested those times, but it was clear that Senator Yarborough was and remained the enemy of Mr. Johnson while they were both in the Senate and after Mr. Johnson became vice president. Since there was a constant clash between Mr. Johnson and Senator Yarborough on patronage matters, President Kennedy was entirely aware of the situation. Much later, it was suggested that the purpose of the president's trip was to settle this tiresome old feud. The idea is ridiculous. First, both men operated in Washington, not in Texas. So it's saying that some people thought that maybe Kennedy was coming down to try to settle this feud between Yarborough and Johnson. But that actually, if that was the case, he could have just done so in D.C. because that's primarily where they operated as senators and as the vice president. They didn't need to come back to Texas to do that. One was across the street from the president, and one was less than a mile away, and Washington would have been the place to settle it. Second, presidents never insert themselves into such quarrels, for they can only get hurt. Third, the president couldn't have settled it anyway. The quarrel is implacable. The trouble began, and though irritating, I would not say it was serious, when Senator Yarborough started to urge changes in the planning onto the president's advance men, who in turn tried to force the changes onto me. They wanted to give the president more crowd exposure and less of the exposure I believed he needed, and from our conversation in the White House, believed he wanted. My essentially non-political focus on the businessmen who have power in politics partly through the money they contribute, but even more through their influence in their communities, did indeed tend to cut out some of the president's most ardent supporters. He could have had, for instance, the type of trip that involves great public rallies, receptions for labor, intense liberals, leaders of the minority groups. But speaking politically, I felt that this trip should primarily aim not at those who already supported him, but at those who did not. I mean, that's good political thinking. It's interesting if you're trying to shore up support in a conservative state. It makes sense, this approach. We went right ahead with the planning. A decision to dedicate the Aerospace Medical Center at Brooks Air Force Base in San Antonio on Thursday, November 21st, would serve as the non-political reason for him coming. The motorcade through downtown San Antonio, which always produces good crowds, would solve his public exposure. He agreed to speak at an appreciation dinner for Albert Thomas, the veteran Democratic congressman. It was not ideal from our point of view, but many of the dinner guests were powers in Houston business, and we would be getting the basic exposure we wanted. In Fort Worth, we set up a breakfast with the Chamber of Commerce, and in Dallas, a luncheon with influential, nonpartisan citizen groups. Then, having shown the business community that the president did not have horns and a tail, he would move into straight politics. He would go into Austin for a big political reception, receive the Texas legislature in the governor's mansion, and go on to a $100 a plate dinner. The plans for the Austin meeting suggest how complicated these matters become. Secret Servicemen had to check the hotel where the first reception would be held, the mansion, and the hall for dinner. The route the president would drive was checked and timed. Arrangements for the first reception were made. The mansion is not big enough to handle all the legislators at once, so we arranged to receive them in 2 shifts. And there was only an hour on the tight schedule, which meant half-hour shifts, which meant no refreshments would be served because one group had to be herded out as the next came in. A caterer took over the banquet, 3,000 steaks, each 16 ounces and well cooked. Wow. To be served hot approximately at once. That's a hard thing to pull off. Potatoes, vegetables, several kinds of wine, desserts, all the equipment and all the people to handle it. And then there were the decorations, the sound system, the lighting, the furnishings. These dinners are ticklish. They must be so well done that the purchaser of an $100 ticket feels he's been entertained, but not so lavish that he thinks his political contribution is being wasted. Then there's the program, who will speak and for how long. There are the seating arrangements, who will be at the head of the table, who will sit closest and who farthest. Political contributors, in effect, are politicians. They have their own influence to protect. They consider themselves important and have definite ideas about how they should be treated. Handling such a dinner becomes an exercise in diplomacy. Thus, we came to the final week in a welter of detail, confusion, and change. Enthusiasm was weak and ticket sales lagged. I manned a battery of long-distance phones for 2 nights and personally sold more than $50,000 worth of tickets. Wow. Frequently, I had to ask the purchasers to take them as a favor to me. So he's putting himself on the line, using his political capital, just as he said. President Kennedy's own advance men continued to press for greater public exposure of the president in what amounted to fundamental disagreement on the purpose of the trip. In Fort Worth, for instance, they scheduled an outdoor speech in a parking lot across from the president's hotel. But the biggest change, and as it turns out, the saddest and most disastrous, took place in Dallas. The Washington advance men wanted a motorcade. I wanted to skip the motorcade and go directly to the Trade Mart for luncheon. There was a heated argument over this between the president's advance people and my planning staff in Dallas. My point was that motorcades are exhausting. This may seem surprising, but it's true. You sit there with all eyes focused on you. The wind blows and ruffles your wife's hair. You wave and smile just enough to look interested, not enough to look foolish. Block after block, you maintain this quality of giving yourself in what amounts to thousands upon thousands of minute human encounters. And I think it has a powerful psychic drain. On that single Friday, the president was scheduled to make 2 speeches in Fort Worth, an important luncheon speech in Dallas, appear at 2 receptions in Austin, and then give his most significant speech of all at the fundraising dinner that night. People know when the speaker is tired and not giving his best. I wanted President Kennedy rested and in good spirits, not exhausted. But in the end, I was overruled. The president's advancement on the scene in Dallas laid on the motorcade through the heart of downtown. Then they released the route itself for publication in the Tuesday newspapers a full 3 days before the event. All of these differences were settled and almost forgotten, however, by the early afternoon of Thursday, November 21st, 1963, when President and Mrs. Kennedy landed at San Antonio. I believed that the trip would be smooth and successful. He would see an excellent cross-section of Texas, would be warmly welcomed by the people, and would raise more than $300,000, half of which would stay in Texas. All the planning and myriad details were settled. The governor's mansion, for instance, was spotless in anticipation of the reception at which the president would meet the legislators on Friday night, before the Austin dinner. And then, at the last moment, my wife Nellie decided that the rugs were not quite right and had them cleaned all over again. Nellie and I met the president and his wife with real elation. I had been governor for less than 11 months, and this was the first time I had been host to the President of the United States. It had all the responsibilities and all the pleasures, I thought, of having him to one's home. Sorry, I had to open up the windows a little bit. I love when it gets bright enough to do that when I'm recording in the mornings. There is a great air that surrounds the presidency of excitement and even glamour, and I think this infected us all. Nellie had flown over from Austin, and I had come from Houston, where I had made a speech. Vice President and Mrs. Johnson landed first, and we awaited the president together. When Air Force One stopped and the doors opened, I recall that Mrs. Kennedy came out first. She was a stunning figure in white, and then the president appeared looking tanned and fit, smiling, bareheaded. A great roar went up from the crowd at the airport. The vice president greeted them, and then I said, "Welcome to Texas, Mr. President." He smiled and put out his hand and said, "John, how are you?" in that New England tone. And I said, "We are just delighted, and we are happy to see you here." And that was the truth. This was climax to all the plans and preparations, and we were prepared to enjoy it. We got into the cars and started to San Antonio. Nellie and I were on the jump seats of the president's car, and I remember a tumult of thoughts. I was host for my state, and I wanted it and its people to perform well. And at the same time, I was presenting the president to my state, and I wanted him to be happy and to respond well. So I was awaiting with interest and perhaps a little apprehension the tone of the crowds. San Antonio was marvelous. The crowds were big and warm, and there were cries of "Viva Kennedy!" Mrs. Kennedy seemed a trifle unsure of herself, but many of the shouts and the signs were directed to her, and she responded graciously. The president's speech at the medical center was good and well received, and when we were back in Air Force One on the way to Houston, he obviously was pleased. Nellie and I rode in his cabin, and he twirled on his big chair and asked if we would do as well in Houston. There was a jubilant air of a successful start. We were less certain of the reception in Houston. People are so widely dispersed in Texas that there is no way to manufacture crowds. They come or they don't. Yeah, it's not New York City. You have to drive to get anywhere. So people have to show up, and if they don't, they don't. We did, however, manage to put the president's motorcade down the Gulf Freeway at about 5 p.m. when the homeward bound cars would be a solid river. But it was an unnecessary precaution. The crowds in Houston were just as warm and friendly as they had been in San Antonio, though we were not in an actual parade. That night, the president got a rousing ovation from the crowd at the Albert Thomas dinner when he strode in. He had eaten at the hotel beforehand since, like most major speakers, he did not like to eat at the dinner at which he spoke. It was a good speech, short as always, burnished with clever touches, and it was very successful. I'll confess that I don't listen with full attention at such events. I watch the crowd for the little signs that are the real indicators of one's success. And that reaction that night from men who represent the backbone of Houston was very good. They were attentive, friendly, ready to be pleased, and they applauded enthusiastically. We flew on Thursday night to Fort Worth, more subdued now, everyone on the plane tired. It was near midnight when we landed at Carswell Air Force Base, and there was a light drizzle, but even so, there were little knots of people standing in the darkness and waving as the president's closed car passed. There was a big crowd at the Texas Hotel, and the lobby was packed with cheering people. The president worked his way through, smoothly, smiling and nodding, and caught the elevator. After I had taken Nellie to our suite, I went down to the coffee shop for scrambled eggs and a glass of milk. Fort Worth was home, and I knew most of the people in the coffee shop. They were all discussing the Yarborough incident. It seemed that on 2 occasions that day in San Antonio and again in Houston, Senator Yarborough had refused publicly to ride with Vice President Johnson. It was an affront to the office of the Vice President, and it was just the sort of lively thing that attracts the press. I knew there would be a stir in the morning papers. So these 2 men, he didn't want to be in the car with him. On Friday morning before the breakfast affair, I saw President Kennedy waiting to make his entrance after everyone else was seated. He was sitting on one of a row of straight chairs, and he beckoned me over. "John, did you know that Yarborough refused to ride with Lyndon yesterday?" I said I did, and he said, "What's the matter with that fella?" I said I didn't know, and a cold, exceedingly firm look came over President Kennedy's face. "I tell you one thing, he'll ride with him today or he'll walk." A few minutes later, the president was seen in conversation with Senator Yarborough. The president was doing the talking and the senator the listening. And when we left Fort Worth at mid-morning, Senator Yarborough rode with Mr. Johnson. They rode together again in Dallas. It was an unpleasant incident, but quite minor. After the assassination, when everything that had happened became important and much talked about, it came to seem significant. I think there is no doubt that this fed the gradual growth of the public impression that the president went to Texas to settle a feud. He did require Senator Yarborough to pay Mr. Johnson the simple courtesy of riding him in a car with him, but there was no more to it than that. It was still drizzling in Fort Worth that morning, but the president appeared in good spirits. He seemed to have slept well. The Secret Service had selected his suite, one that was rather plainly furnished, but had only one door. Contrary to reports made much later that it was dingy and poor, the hotel had renovated it. What's more, a committee had gathered from private homes all over Fort Worth a collection of great paintings worth, I suppose, nearly $1 million. A Picasso, I remember, and a Monet, a Van Gogh, and many others to hang in the suite. Before President Kennedy came down that morning, he had called Mrs. J. Lee Johnson III, who had assembled it, and thanked her. Again, his speeches at breakfast to the Chamber of Commerce and to the public in the parking lot across the street from the hotel were strong and laced with a pleasant touch of fun. He certainly impressed the Fort Worth Chamber members just as I had anticipated. We flew the few miles to Dallas at about 11 a.m., and while we were still airborne, he looked out the window and said with a smile, "Our luck is holding. It looks as if we'll get sunshine." And indeed, when we landed, it was a whole different day. The clouds were gone and the sun was crisp and brilliant. Texas has magnificent weather in the fall, and now in this most crucial of Texas cities, we were being favored. There was an overpowering sense of success, and I know that President Kennedy felt it too. I had been worried about Dallas, fearing not violence, but embarrassment. An ugly advertisement had run that very morning in the Dallas Morning News. A month before, United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson had been hit on the head by a picket sign. There had been the 1960 attack on Senator Johnson, in which he was jostled and spat at by Nixon supporters. I was afraid of rude signs, or that the crowds might be hostile, or, what is almost as bad, apathetic or sullen. I had objected to the parade route being announced well in advance because that lends itself to organized heckling. But as we neared downtown about noon and the crowds thickened, all my fears fell away. The people were friendly, waving, smiling, calling his name and Mrs. Kennedy's name. They were out in huge numbers long before we got into the center of the city, and it was plain that the president was enjoying himself. We saw only one unfortunate sign. It read, I believe, "Kennedy, go home." He nudged my shoulder and gestured with his thumb. "See that sign, John?" he asked. I said that I had and that I hoped he hadn't. He grinned. I see them everywhere I go, he said, adding with an edge of sarcasm, I bet that's a nice guy. At another point where the clouds slackened momentarily, he asked John, how do things look in Texas? He had been warmed by the crowd and the success, and his political interest was quickening. There'll be a Houston Chronicle poll out tomorrow, I said, which should give us some ideas. What's it going to show? He asked. I think it will show that you can carry the state, but that it will be a close election. Oh? How will it show you running? Mr. President, I said, I think it will show me running a little ahead of you. That doesn't surprise me, he said. And that was the last conversation we had. We came back into heavy crowds then, and of course you cannot talk in the car at such times, for the people who have come to see you realize your interest is not with them and they resent it. Because we spent so much of our time together in motorcades, the fact is I didn't talk to the president a great deal. There was a bright glitter to the sunshine, and after a while Mrs. Kennedy slipped on a big pair of sunglasses. When the president looked around, he said in a low voice, "Take off your glasses, Jackie." She had no way of knowing, but glasses are nearly as effective as a mask for hiding one's face and making participation in a parade almost useless. In a moment, forgetting perhaps, she slipped them back on, and I heard him say in the same tone, "Take off the glasses, Jackie." He was watching the crowds, waving at them steadily with a stiff forearm, his right hand moving only a few inches out from his face and back. It was a small movement and curiously formal, but I thought quite effective. I heard a low, monotone rumble from the back, and then I realized he was responding, "Thank you, thank you, thank you," over and over to people who couldn't hear him but who could sense he was answering them, who knew that contact had been made. And then he turned his head slightly and said, "Jackie, take off your glasses." And the crowd was wild. We passed a school, and the children surged into the street, so excited they were, shaking my hand too. In the downtown city, people were back in the streets and packed the sidewalks clear back to the buildings. They were hanging out of windows 10 stories up, waving banners and signs. They were smiling, laughing, pointing, waving, shrieking greetings. Some schools were out, and the young girls would surge into the street in front of his car, and pandemonium would break. It was an incredible show, directed as much as at Mrs. Kennedy as at him, and I had the feeling she was relaxing, unbending, learning to enjoy it. This was the final success, and the last of my worry evaporated. The people on the street were his. The business community, whose help he needed, had been impressed and would be more so at the luncheon that day and at Austin that night. The president looked strong and confident, obviously delighted with his reception. Nellie leaned back between the jump seats and said proudly over the crowd's roar, "You can't say now that Dallas doesn't love you, Mr. President." And he smiled and nodded. The big car turned off Main Street and slowly negotiated the turn under the looming school book depository building and started down the hill in the bright sunshine. And that is how that article ends.
Unbelievable what can happen.
We do have this photograph of the three of them there in Fort Worth that morning where President Kennedy is speaking. We have Governor Connally there in the middle and Lyndon Johnson here at this side. The three men whose fates would intertwine that day in a major way. Something interesting about Connally is that some people have mentioned, wow, I didn't realize he almost died in that accident, but he did. His wounds were very serious. He ended up having surgery, I believe, on his wrist. He had many wounds that went through his back, his wrist, and his thigh. And I have read before, although it wasn't in this article, that his wound, I believe maybe his chest wound, that had he not leaned on Mrs. Connally the way that he did, that he would have bled out. I don't know if that's true or not, but it seems like it is true, that they were really surprised that he hadn't, and it was because of the way she had kind of pulled him into herself. So anyway, that is this Life magazine, the Kennedys and the Connollys in San Antonio there on November 21st, and why Kennedy went to Texas in addition to the last seconds of the motorcade. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this reading, what you thought of this magazine. Again, if you missed part 1, go back and see it because of all of those unpublished photographs that were there. They, of course, now have been seen, but I actually think these are the clearest, most crisp images of those photos that I've ever seen. So I hope you enjoyed them as well. You guys have a great day, and we'll take the conversation to the comments. Come back next time. Bye.